Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. Who'd be a pundit in these uncertain times? A week ago, we spent the whole show talking about Matt Hancock, a bloke who admitted to letting the nation down while playing away from home. This morning, we're celebrating a whole team that also played away, but made us proud. At Wimbledon, instead of the usual Sunday morning blues that all the plucky Brits have been knocked out in the first 7 days, there's news that a British woman, Emma Raducanu, has made it into the second week. In politics, to most people's surprise, Labour held Batley and Spen. And we awakened this morning to the sound of Downing Street whispers that the hitherto cautious Prime Minister may be about to let us ditch the masks and go back to spending Saturday night clubbing, as we all do here before coming in to chart the road ahead for you, your regular Sunday morning political sat-nav. So, after 2 by-election defeats, are the wheels coming off the Johnson bus? The Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, will be with us in a moment. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves on why Labour thinks they're back on the road to number 10. Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party's had some trouble deciding who should be at the wheel in recent times, but in his first television interview since becoming leader, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson tells our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins, how he sees the way ahead. Plus, I'll ask Adam Finn, who's a member of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, if we're still cruising towards the easing of lockdown on July the 19th. And a broadcast exclusive, the veteran American pollster Frank Luntz on a new survey of the electorate's mood. There may be trouble ahead. But first, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, joined me. Mr. Jenrick, the new Health Secretary says in an article this morning that we have to learn to accept the existence of COVID, just as we do with the flu. Now, according to the Office for National Statistics, there are some 20,000 deaths associated with flu in a typical year. Are we now saying that that annual toll with COVID is inevitable?
Hi, well, good morning, Trevor. I think we are now reaching a different phase in the virus. We're not going to put the COVID-19 virus behind us forever. We're going to have to learn to live with it. But thanks to the enormous success of our vaccine programme, the fact that now we've got to the point where 83% of adults in this country have had at least one jab, we should be able to think about how we can return to normality as much as possible. And the data that we're seeing, that the Prime Minister's reviewing at the moment ahead of his decision point on the roadmap, looks very positive. It does seem as if we can now move forward and move to a much more permissive regime where we move away from many of those restrictions that have been so difficult for us. And as you say, learn to live with the virus. That does mean that we're going to have to treat it carefully. We're going to have to keep on monitoring the cases, and we're going to have to ensure that every adult gets double vaxxed, because that is the key to keeping the virus under control as we move into the autumn and the winter.
That's admirably clear, and it looks as though you are following the Prime Minister's suggestion that we will be lifting the restrictions. But the BMA, the British Medical Association, is urging caution. For example, keeping the requirement for face masks in public places. Now, Mr. Jenrick, will you be dumping your mask on July the 20th?
Well, like many people, I want to get away from these restrictions as quickly as I possibly can. And we don't want them to stay in place for a day longer than is necessary. We are going to, I think, now move into a period where there won't be legal restrictions. The state won't be telling you what to do, but you will want to exercise a degree of personal responsibility and judgment. So different people will come to different conclusions on things like masks, for example. And the Prime Minister will set out more detail on the national policy on some of those restrictions in the coming days. But there will be things that we all definitely need to do. As I say, it will be essential that every adult gets fully vaccinated. And there are still people in the most significant categories 1 to 9, who haven't been vaccinated. 50,000 people in those categories got vaccinated in the last week. They've come forward relatively late in the process, but it's really important that we get those remaining people vaccinated. It will also be important that we do things like making sure that the most vulnerable get their flu vaccinations this autumn and winter, because that will be a big issue. There will be things we need to do as a society to make sure that we get through this.
Before we go on to that, can we just deal with the question I asked you? If you are permitted, will you be getting rid of your mask?
I will. I don't particularly want to wear a mask. I don't think a lot of people enjoy doing it. We will be moving into a phase, though, where these will be matters of personal choice. And so some members of society will want to do so for perfectly legitimate reasons. But it will be a different period where we as private citizens make these judgments rather than the government telling you what to do.
OK. Now, apparently, today is National Thank You Day. Whose idea was that? And what would you, the government, like the nation to be doing once they've stopped watching this programme?
Well, it was actually a bottom-up idea. It came from local communities. They came together and established this idea that this is a moment in which we can all go and say a big thank you to those who've helped us in our daily lives over the course of the last year. Perhaps those people who've gone out of their way to support the community through COVID-19, or others who've done good work. The Prime Minister will be hosting some of those who've helped us through the pandemic at Number 10. And I know people in my own community that I would like to say a big thank you to.
Isn't this a bit previous? You've just advised me to wait for the Prime Minister's statement on July the 19th, but you're encouraging everybody to barbecue today. I mean, couldn't this have waited a couple of weeks until we actually know what the guidance is going to be? Isn't this yet another case of the government sending mixed messages?
No, the government didn't create National Thank You Day. It's actually been created by members of the public.
You didn't have to back it today. We can say thank you any time in the next 6 months if we want to.
Well, as I say, the government didn't create this day. It's been created by members of the public who themselves wanted to say thank you. Of course, there are guidelines in place that you have to follow if you're holding an event today, and I'm sure the Prime Minister and others who are doing so will make sure that they are followed. But the point of the day is for those of us who benefited from the hard work and compassion, empathy that others have provided over the course of the last year to reach out to them and say thank you. And that can be done in many ways. There may be some people who are holding socially distanced get-togethers, but there'll be plenty of other people who might use this opportunity simply to pick up the phone to somebody who's done good work and really help them out over the course of the last year.
Yes, indeed. We can say thank you in many ways. Wouldn't one way be for the Health Secretary or the Prime Minister to pick up the phone to the, let's say, the Royal College of Nursing or the BMA and say, you know what, we've decided that 1% pay rise, which is below inflation, is going to be boosted by 2 or 3%. That would be a real way to say thank you, wouldn't it?
Well, we all want to reward those people who've worked in the NHS and social care as local government secretary. I feel very strongly about that. That, at the moment, is a topic for the independent pay review body, who will be providing advice to the health secretary and the government in the coming months. And armed with that, we'll make a decision. But certainly in my role, I've always striven to provide local government with the resources it needs to fund social care. We've done that over the course of the pandemic. We've now done it with 2 record-breaking settlements for the local government sector since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and I very much hope we'll be in a position to do that in the future.
So we're not stuck to the 1%. It could be higher in the end.
Well, the process is that the recommendation is judged by the independent pay review body, and then it comes to ministers for a final decision. So nothing is set in stone, but we as ministers will have to wait for the advice that we receive from the pay review body, and that's the right thing to do.
Right, well, let's keep talking about how we say thank you. You say in your release that you want to thank people who have provided refuge for women facing domestic abuse, which everybody agrees has risen during lockdown. So now, women who are afraid to venture out onto the high street in case they run into their abusers are being urged to rock up today to a cheery barbecue whilst having nowhere to go later because of lack of funds for refugees. Now, that would be a good way of saying thank you, and I think that's in your bailiwick, isn't it? Why not say thank you today with some more money for domestic abuse refugees, for the women who have suffered violence?
Well, Trevor, we are doing that. We passed the Domestic Abuse Act earlier in the year, which is a landmark piece of legislation to ensure that women and men who are victims of domestic abuse get the support that they need in safe and secure accommodation, such as refuges. We've fully funded that major commitment with £125 million, and that money is now with local councils who are ensuring that local services get the support that they need. And in fact, I spoke last week at the Women's Aid conference to the brilliant people who run those refuges across the country to say thank you to them, and also wrote to every local council in the country urging them to use that money wisely and amongst other services that they commission to make sure that they properly fund women's refuges, because they do a fantastic job. They have often been funded in quite a hand-to-mouth way in recent decades. That needs to come to an end now that we've got this very significant amount of extra funding available for them.
Did the leaders of Women's Aid read out to you what they said in their report a couple of months ago, which is the 90 million announced in the budget today is not enough? They then go on to say that they need £393 million of funding, and that there is a shortfall of £200 million in the government's current plans. What are you going to do about that?
Well, I don't recognise those numbers. They're not ones I've actually seen. The amount of funding that
I'm reading it out to you.
I understand that, but the amount of money that we provided, £125 million, is actually considered to be fully funding the refuge and domestic abuse duties that now fall on local councils as a result.
But not by Women's Aid.
Well, I had a very good conversation with the Chief Executive Women's Aid and with representatives of those who run refuges during the week. They appreciate the funding. Of course, people would always like to have more money, but this is a very significant increase in the amount of funding that any government has given in the past for women's refuges and for other services that will be provided for victims of domestic abuse. The key thing now is to make sure that councils perform their duties under this new piece of legislation correctly, and they include giving women and other victims of domestic abuse priority for social housing if they need to leave their home, ensuring that they get the support services that they need that can be delivered in many different settings, and, as I say, making sure that refuges across the country are put on a sustainable financial footing, so we don't see the situation that I'm afraid we have done in the past, which is where some of those refugees are having to kind of survive year in, year out with too little money and not long-term sustainable funding. We're going to change that.
Well, perhaps you need to have another conversation with them. But let's talk about Batley and Spen. You lost when you might have won. Do you blame Matt Hancock?
Well, look, of course, I'm disappointed that we lost. We had a great candidate, Ryan Stevenson. I'd love to have seen him in Parliament. But governments very, very rarely take seats off oppositions in by-elections. In fact, there's only been one instance in recent years, which was Hartlepool, which was an exceptional result. Actually, this was the biggest swing from an opposition to the party of government for 39 years, so in my lifetime. So it was still a fantastic result for the Conservative Party, albeit not exactly what we would have hoped for. And I think there are a lot of questions for Keir Starmer as to how the Labour Party are just scraping home by 300 or so votes when they should be romping home in these sorts of elections. OK, well, here's a question for you. Given that you had a 8,000 vote leg up from George Galloway, who took votes from Labour, actually, it wasn't that good a result for you. And surely there's something more fundamental going on here, as there was in Chesham and Amersham. Could it be that, like in Chesham, many people in those very pretty villages around Batley think that your planning reforms mean that your idea of levelling up is allowing developers to concrete over their villages and fields? No, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, on the question of the by-elections, as I say, governments extremely rarely take seats off the opposition in by-elections. Of course, it was also a disappointing result in Cheshire and Amersham, but the argument put out there very disingenuously by the Lib Dems that there were huge amounts of houses being built in that area was simply untrue. Last year, only 100 houses were built in the Cheshire and Amersham constituency, which I think was the 10th lowest of any local authority in the whole country. What we want to see are good quality, environmentally sustainable homes with the infrastructure around them being built across the country so that young people and families can get onto the housing ladder. That's absolutely critical to levelling up, to tackling intergenerational unfairnesses in this country. And we're going to redouble our efforts to build those homes, but do so in a way that protects green spaces. They won't be being built on the green belt. And we want to make a planning system which is much more engaging than the current one, in which only 1 or 2% of the public have any contact with in their lifetimes.
When we're talking about levelling up, on Friday you were in a place called Kidsgrove, which is near Stoke-on-Trent. You were talking about the importance of the investments that you're making locally, and you tweeted levelling up in action, where £17 million of investment from the Towns Fund has enabled the reopening of the sports centre there in Kidsgrove. Would it not have been simpler if the Conservative-led Staffordshire County Council hadn't withdrawn their subsidy in 2017 to that sports centre in the first place? Then you wouldn't have had to make that investment.
Well, the Towns Fund is part of our now almost £10 billion investment into towns and smaller cities across the country, aimed to improve living standards, improve quality of life. And I was really pleased to go to Kidsgrove by Stoke-on-Trent, as you say, on Friday and see how it's impacting people's lives there. The decision actually was taken by a Labour council there. It was very unfortunate. As a result of the Towns Fund, we're changing that, and that sports centre is being brought back into community use as we speak. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to do more things like that across the country, particularly examples like that where it's actually community ownership. That's a sports centre that's going to be run by the local community itself, not by a council, but by a group of engaged local residents coming together. And we're putting funding available for those sorts of schemes to happen right across the country.
One last very quick question, if I may, Mr. Jenrick. Last week was the 4th anniversary of the awful events at the Grenfell Tower, and the government has been making quite a lot of money available to repair cladding. But the estimates to deal with the range of buildings across the country are as high as £15 billion, and you've made about £3.5 billion available. That means that many flat owners across the country are having to pay, and we've seen lots of reports this week, are having to pay the price of their entire properties in order to repair the cladding. That surely cannot be right.
Well, I have huge sympathy with those leaseholders who are placed in an impossible situation. The government is actually putting over £5 billion towards this issue. We're ensuring that the most dangerous material, ACM cladding and other unsafe forms of cladding, are removed from all high-rise buildings in the country at no cost to leaseholders. That work is underway now, and we're making good progress.
What about the rest?
We're also trying to ensure there's a much more sensible and proportionate approach to risk on other buildings, particularly the lower-rise ones, because we are seeing examples of leaseholders being asked to pay bills for works which seem to be unnecessary. There's no actually higher risk of an individual living in a purpose-built flat or a high-rise building than in any other building. In fact, more people die in fires in houses and bungalows than they do in high-rise apartments. So we're working with lenders and insurers and surveyors to try to create a much more sensible and proportionate way forwards.
Mr. Jenrick, thank you very much indeed. Now, hanging on to Batlin Spen may have eased the pressure on the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, for now. But even his deputy says that people don't quite know what he stands for. And an exclusive poll for Sky News found this week that 7 out of 10 Labour members would prefer to see the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, as leader. How long before another leadership challenge? Let's ask Sir Keir's most senior shadow cabinet colleague, Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves, Batley Spen, a narrow squeak, but you won. Peter Mandelson says this gives Sir Keir until September to come up with a case for remaining leader of the party. Do you agree?
Well, it was a great result in Batley and Spen, and I can't tell you how pleased I am that Kim Leadbeater is going to be joining me in Parliament on Monday, tomorrow, as the Member of Parliament for Batley and Spen. And it's a seat that means so much to all of us in the Labour Party, and Kim is an inspiration. She will shake up Westminster in every good possible way. And that by-election, which I fought hard in as well, it's very near to me in Leeds West, was a by-election like none other that I have seen during my 25 years involved in the Labour Party and in politics. It was a campaign full of so much hatred and division, stoked by people from outside of Batley and Spen, and that victory in the early hours of Friday morning was a victory for decency over division, for hope over hatred, and for integrity in politics. And that is the Labour Party that Keir Starmer stands for, and it is the Labour Party that is embodied by the campaign that Kim and the team ran in Batley and Spen. So I am delighted by the result and can't wait to see Kim get started as MP in Westminster and in her community.
I fully understand that, but do you agree with the Mandelson deadline of September?
Look, Keir is elected as leader of the Labour Party. Today I'm setting out ambitious plans for Labour, for how, as Chancellor, I would ensure that we buy, make and sell more in Britain. And I think that the party in Batley and Spen came together under Keir's leadership with Kim as the candidate. It showed everything that is best about the Labour Party. And under Keir's leadership and with Kim in Parliament, I think that we can build on that success in Batley and Spen going into the summer, then with our party conference, and then campaigning at the next general election like we campaigned in Batley and Spen, go on for more victories going forward.
OK, well, you're not disagreeing with Lord Mandelson, but you are stressing the excellence of your stressing the excellence of your candidate.
No, Keir, under Keir's leadership, we won in Batley and Spen. Keir will take us into the next election, and I believe that that result in the early hours of Friday morning is the start of more victories for Labour.
All right, before we leave Batley and Spen, you spoke of the hatred and division being sowed in that election campaign, as did Sir Keir on Friday morning. Who exactly was sowing hatred and division?
Well, I mean, I was there on many occasions and I saw some of the behaviours of George Galloway and his campaign and the violence and aggression shown towards both Kim and other Labour activists. There is no place for the sort of behaviour that we saw in Batley and Spen in any election, but especially in a place like Batley and Spen that has been through so much in the last 5 years or so and deserved so much better than what they saw during this by-election campaign. And the people of Batley and Spen rejected that, and they voted for Kim. And Kim is now their MP, and I know that Kim will do everything in her power to bring the community together, as she has over the last 5 years, running schemes like More in Common, Batley and Spen. And I am so proud of Kim, but also of the people of Batley and Spen.
Thank you for being so clear in pointing the finger at Mr. Galloway. Does that mean that either the 8,200 and odd people who voted for him didn't realise what he was about, or that they actually like the idea of hatred and division? What's going on there?
There was a huge amount of fake news being pushed out in that constituency, and there was the whipping up of tensions that has no place in our democracy. Kim now has a job to do to bring that community together. I know that she can do that, and will start on that work immediately. I don't hold it against anyone for voting for different parties, but the role of an MP is to bring communities together, whoever they voted for, and show that decency and hope and integrity can triumph, as it did in Batley and Spen last week.
There is something that comes out of this two things that come out of this campaign. First of all, Labour Party issued a leaflet showing Boris Johnson and Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, together with a caption saying, "Don't risk a Tory MP who is not on your side." What was that about? Why Mr. Modi?
Well, if you look at some of the actions by Boris Johnson during the course of this pandemic, one of the things that stands out very sharply is the failure to close the borders properly to protect us from new variants of the virus, including the Delta variant. And the Prime Minister Johnson, wanted his trade visit to India to get a trade deal, but he put at risk the vaccine rollout and allowed new variants to enter the country. That is not responsible. That is not acting in the national interest. And Labour called on the government to close down that border to protect the UK long before the Prime Minister eventually woke up to the reality, the rising number of cases and the risk to our successful vaccination programme.
It is unusual to have a foreign leader on the leaflets of a candidate in a local by-election. I just want you to clear up the Labour view on the allegation that this was, I think the words that are being used are dog whistle to Muslim voters, that actually the Tories are in some way anti-Muslim and that they identify with what is said to be an anti-Muslim government led by Mr. Modi. There's none of that going on here.
I don't accept that insinuation, Trevor. What we saw in Batley and Spen was underhand tactics by Galloway and his campaign, bringing in people from outside to whip up that hatred and division with actual violence and aggression towards the Labour candidate, harassing, intimidating, chasing her down the street, and also to Labour activists. That is the true nature of what was happening in Batley and Spen, but the people of that community rose above that and returned Kim as their MP last week. That is a great result for Labour. It's also a great result for Batley and Spen.
All right, let's talk about what you want to talk about today, which is your promise that a Labour government would make, buy and sell more in Britain and that you'd bring more jobs home. Is this an update to Gordon Brown's pledge of British jobs for British workers?
It's very different from that. This is about a post-pandemic recovery plan and how, as Chancellor, I would ensure that we support high street, small businesses and jobs and industry across the United Kingdom as we address some of the big challenges that we face as a country. And I put together a three-point plan to buy, make and sell more in Britain. And that includes using all the tools at government's disposal to do so. So, for example, with procurement, to use stretching targets in procurement to award more contracts to companies that are creating jobs and skills and apprenticeships here in Britain, to help businesses who want post-pandemic and also post-Brexit to reshore jobs, to make their supply chains more secure and resilient, to help them to do that, and also to sort out the big gaping holes in the Brexit deal that the government signed last year, to make it easier for British industries and workers to export goods and services across the European Union, especially in our creative industries, professional services and in farming and fisheries as well. And with that three-point plan, we can ensure that we're buying, making and selling more in this country, ensuring that the UK economy is firing on all cylinders and that we are more secure and more resilient in face of the sorts of shocks that any economy, and especially one that's been through everything we've been through in the last year and a half, to ensure that we are more secure and resilient in the face of those shocks.
I think this is what distinguished economists like yourself call a non-tariff barrier. So let's take an example and see how this would work in reality. Biggest construction project in the country, pretty much, HS2, high-speed line. 6 months ago, the bosses of HS2 picked a small group of construction companies to compete for contracts worth £2.5 billion for new rail lines. Now, just one of the companies they picked is British. Would your proposals mean that HS2, when they make their decision, would be more likely to pick the British company?
Well, I think that's a really good example, Trevor, because whether or not you think that HS2 should go ahead, and I know there are big differences of opinion on that, I think we can all agree that that investment should benefit jobs, skills, apprenticeships and businesses here in Britain, because it is in our national interest to create those high-skill, well-paid jobs. And what my proposals that I am setting out today of how I would approach this as Chancellor of the Exchequer would say that when you look at the different bids that come in for any project, whether it be HS2 or offshore wind or whatever it is, you can look at the plans of the businesses bidding for that contract to see what impact it would have on the wider UK economy, what strategic value a bid has. And if it is creating jobs in this country, high-skilled, well-paid jobs and apprenticeships, and that means that we're building up that skill set so we can export around the world, those bids should get more weight than bids that are creating no jobs, no skills and no investment in this country. So it's not saying that we won't give contracts to foreign companies. Absolutely not. But it is saying, like in France and like in the United States, we would take into account the social impact of any public procurement. Other countries do that because they know it is strategically important. And yet, in the UK, we don't use those powers that we have at our disposal, and that is a mistake, and I would do that differently.
So you say this is a good example. So as Chancellor, what you would do is create an environment in which, in that case, the British company, Balfour Beatty, would be favoured. So you would be leaning on HS2 bosses toward the contract to a company implicated in the 2005 Hatfield rail crash, a company whose management has been was blacklisted because it blacklisted trade union activists and still faces legal action from some unions, and a company which in 2019 was suspended from bidding for government work because it consistently made payments to small and medium-sized businesses late. Is that the sort of company that Labour wants to see getting the work because it's got a Union Jack on its website?
Trevor, it wouldn't be me as Chancellor leaning on public bodies to award contracts. What it is about is changing the procurement framework so you can take into account labour standards, job creation in this country and environmental standards as well. So there is a level playing field for businesses doing business in this country, and we take into account the whole value of the bid, including the impact it would have on the environment, on labour standards and on jobs in this country. As I say, under WTO rules, under the trade agreement that we did with our European partners last year, these things are possible. Other countries do it because they know it is strategically important. We should as well. And that would ensure that we create more good jobs for small businesses and large businesses here in Britain. And that is the right thing to do. It's not what is happening at the moment in a whole range of government contracts, whether it is offshore wind or HS2 or Trident submarines. We need to do things differently because we have to grow the industries of the future and ensure that there are more good quality, high-paid jobs in every corner of our country. And as Chancellor of the Exchequer, I would use every tool at my disposal to ensure that the UK economy is firing on all cylinders and creating more good quality jobs that you can raise a family on.
Just one very quick last question. This is your first big announcement as Shadow Chancellor. Your predecessor, John McDonnell, said that you can't understand capitalism without reading Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Have you had that privilege?
I haven't, Trevor, had that privilege of reading it, but I studied economics for my degree and for my master's degree. I worked for many years at the Bank of England, at the British Embassy in Washington as an economist, and for Halifax Bank of Scotland. So I hope my credentials speak for themselves. And as Chancellor, I would do things differently, but always ensuring that our policies are costed, that they add up, and that they are in the best interests of the British people.
OK, I'm sure Mr McDonnell's got a spare copy to lend you if you want it. Rachel Reeves, thank you very much.
Thank you, Trevor.
We are now just over a fortnight away from July the 19th, the day on which the government still seemed determined to remove most remaining COVID restrictions in England. With 85% of adults having been given one dose of a vaccine and nearly two-thirds having received both doses, the link between case numbers and hospitalisation appears to have been broken. Or has it? Well, the paediatrician Adam Finn is a member of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, which advises the government on its vaccines policy. He joins us from Coimbra in Portugal. Dr. Finn, are we on track for the end of lockdown, do you think?
It's a really difficult question to answer, to be quite honest. The rate of rise of cases is very substantial at the moment. Of course, there is very clear evidence that the vaccination programme has massively reduced the number of hospitalisations and deaths, but they are nevertheless going up right across the country. And that, I guess, is the critical factor that determines whether or not things can normalise. So, yes, who knows? I guess we are in a very unusual, unprecedented situation, and it's very tricky to give you a straight answer.
Well, we heard from Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, a little earlier, some noises that seem to suggest that we're heading in that direction. But are you sympathetic to the BMA's case that even if we do open up, there should be some restrictions, for example, the maintenance of mask discipline and so on?
Well, on a personal level, I shall certainly be continuing to wear a mask if I've got any symptoms or if I'm in an enclosed space with lots of other people for a prolonged period of time, indefinitely, in fact, because I've learned that by doing that, I can reduce the risk of transmission of all sorts of...
Indefinitely?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we learned, as paediatricians, we learned that we can avoid massive problems with children getting sick in the winter by doing these kind of measures. We simply didn't see the epidemics of respiratory viruses last winter that we've seen every year throughout my career. So I actually now completely understand it, whereas I was puzzled before when I saw Asian people in the tube wearing masks in the pre-pandemic era. So I think mask wearing is obviously something we've learned is extremely valuable to do under certain circumstances. That doesn't mean I'll wear a mask all the time, but it does mean I will some of the time.
Well, if we're thinking about return to normality, some of your scientific colleagues worry that daily publication of data on deaths and infections and hospitalisations and so forth are essentially panicking people rather than reassuring them. Do you think it's time to stop the publication of that data, at least with that frequency?
Well, I actually think that it's important to share information with people. I think the moment you stop doing that, you run the risk of people not trusting you anymore to explain the actions that you're taking. So certainly in the area where I'm involved in advising the government, which is around vaccination, we're very transparent with the data and the evidence that we use to drive those recommendations. Of course, I think when you provide information, you need to explain it. It doesn't really make any sense to just give numbers without explaining what the implications are. But I'm not really in favour of suppressing information, no.
The Health Secretary this morning is saying that we need to learn to accept COVID and treat it essentially as the same as flu. Well, each year, according to the ONS, we see something like 22,000 deaths from flu. Do you accept that actually that is what we're going to have to live with now? It's inevitable.
It looks very likely that this coronavirus, like the others before it, will be with us for the long term. I think in the short term, exactly what it does and how much trouble it causes around the world looks pretty daunting. In the longer term, I think it remains with us. And just how benign it becomes over time is a matter of speculation. But yes, I don't think we're going to see this virus disappear. I think it's going to join all the others that cause trouble for us every year. And we are going to have to learn to live with it in the longer term, yes.
So more excess deaths. Would I know you can't preempt JCVI decisions, but do you expect, therefore, for people to receive a booster vaccination to add to the regular flu vaccination each year?
Well, certainly we've made recommendations in the last week to if you like, provide us a sense of direction as to how a program like that would look and who would be targeted for boosters if it proves necessary. I don't think it's absolutely 100% sure that we need to do that, but I think we need to be prepared for the possibility, particularly if we begin to see signs of waning vaccine protection or escape from the protection that we've got from the vaccines as the virus evolves. So we need to be ready to do a booster program if we need to. So
you are worried about a fourth wave or not worried about a fourth wave?
Okay, you mean one after this one? I think I'm most worried really about the global situation. There are obviously countries where they're in fourth and fifth waves now. And I'm worried about that, not just out of a sense of fairness for the people around the world, but actually also for us in the UK. We've had this experience in the last 2 months of importation of a much more infectious virus from India. That will happen again if the pandemic goes forward unchecked around the world, and we'll be left in a worse problem. And I think that's the most likely scenario to cause a fourth or fifth wave in this country that would be out of control.
Adam Finn, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Sir Jeffrey Donaldson was officially confirmed as the Democratic Unionist Party's latest leader this week. It's third in just 2 months. In his first speech as leader, Sir Jeffrey insisted the only path to stable and sustainable government includes the removal of the Irish sea border, and urged unity against the Brexit deal's Northern Ireland Protocol, which effectively imposed it. But the unity he seeks seems some way off, with the resignation of a DUP Stormont Assembly member on Sir Jeffrey's first day in charge. Well, in his first television interview since becoming leader, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson spoke to our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins, about how to tread the tricky path ahead and his concerns about rising tension on the streets of Northern Ireland.
Sir Jeffrey, you have said the removal of the protocol is the only path to stable government in Northern Ireland. What if it isn't removed?
Well, at the heart of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement are 3 sets of relationships, and there's a very delicate balance within that agreement as to how those relationships are managed. And one of the key relationships is that between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and the agreement is very clear. The principle of consent protects the right of the people of Northern Ireland to determine their constitutional status. When you harm one of those relationships, you harm all of them by extension, and that's exactly what we have seen happening. Because our relationship with Great Britain has been harmed by this protocol, so too our relationship with the Republic of Ireland has been harmed, and indeed it has undermined and destabilised relationships within Northern Ireland itself, and we've seen that even on our streets. So it is imperative for all of us that we resolve these issues. I'm not accepting that this can't be done. I'm not accepting that there is no solution. I believe there is, and that's what I'm going to strive for, and I'm not going to contemplate failure.
You talk about the tension on the streets. The DUP says the government is aware and is listening to the concerns, but this is the same government that promised your party there would never be an Irish sea border. So why should the loyalists who are protesting trust this government?
Well, I understand their scepticism, I really do. We've heard the Prime Minister, even in recent weeks, talk about addressing the issues and the problems created by the protocol. We've heard him recognise that there are difficulties in terms of the relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but not just in trading terms. The Prime Minister also needs to recognise that this impacts on our constitutional position. I'm prepared always to give people a second chance, and I'm prepared to give the Prime Minister an opportunity now to put right what was done wrong to Northern Ireland under the protocol.
But there are those who would say it's time for the DUP to put right the wrong of promoting a Brexit that was going to require a border somewhere. Is it perhaps time to look at the positive, to promote the benefits of having access to the EU market and the GB market?
I believe there are opportunities going forward. but we can't get to those opportunities because of these unnecessary barriers. Much of our supply chain comes from Great Britain. Whether you are a consumer buying goods in a supermarket or a business relying on component parts for your manufacturing process, we need to fix that supply chain problem. We need to restore Northern Ireland's place within the UK, both the market and constitutionally. And if we can do that, then yes, we will see the opportunities that will flow, provided we can find practical solutions on trade with the EU.
Let's talk for a moment about legacy. We've seen another 2 historical prosecutions collapse this week. You're a former soldier, so you will understand the concerns of veterans. You're also a victim. 2 of your cousins were murdered during the Troubles. How does Northern Ireland draw a line under its difficult past? Is there an alternative to the government's proposal of a prosecutorial amnesty?
I think we need a process that moves us from where we are to where we can finally say, well, look, we've examined the past. We have given people the opportunity to explore whether there is the prospect of prosecutions against those who murdered their loved ones. And then, yes, we need to move to the next phase of the peace process. We need to move our society beyond an examination of the past to the kind of reconciliation and healing that we desire to see in Northern Ireland. So we need some form of process that recognises the suffering of many, the injustice that many feel in Northern Ireland. I don't think you can pull a veil over that. I don't think you can ignore that. I think that if we're going to have healing, we need to have recognition and acknowledgement.
You are the DUP's 3rd leader in the space of 2 months. Is the party imploding because of what some would consider to be an own goal on Brexit that resulted in a protocol and unsettled unionism about power sharing and the prospects for Irish unity?
I don't think it is to do with Brexit. I think that the issues that have arisen within the DUP have multiple causes. My job now, my task is to bring the party together again and together on our common ground. The DUP believes passionately in the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We believe passionately that Northern Ireland and all of its people are best served being part of that United Kingdom. We need to broaden the appeal of unionism, and therefore we need to resolve our internal difficulties. I believe we're well on our way now to doing that. The meeting of the party executive this week saw unanimous support for my leadership. It saw people coming together, acknowledging the hurt that had been caused on both sides of the argument. And I think now we're moving away from that, and we've walked back from the idea of factionalism.
Your deputy leader, Paula Bradley, this week apologised to the LGBTQ+ community for what she described as atrocious and hurtful comments made by some elected representatives from the party in the past. Do you share her regret about that? And how will you address any repeat of those comments?
Well, I think it is true, and it's not just in the case of the DUP, that things have been said in the past that have been hurtful to people. And I think it's right when that happens that we say sorry and acknowledge that hurt. Equally, I hope in time others will be able to acknowledge that they have caused hurt, for example, to people from a strongly held faith perspective. David, the kind of Northern Ireland I want is one where we can have respect for difference. And in terms of looking ahead, I hope that my colleagues will recognise that when we take decisions about social issues, when we speak out on social issues, which we are entitled to do, that we do so in a gracious way, that we avoid language that is seen as intemperate or disrespectful. But where that happens, I will not hesitate to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you very much for your time.
Sir Jeffrey Donaldson with David Blevins there. And now one of the political world's most well-known oracles. The American pollster and communications strategist Frank Luntz is best known for his analysis of American politics. He hit the headlines earlier this year when he declared that he'd had enough of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. But he's always retained a keen interest in UK politics too, ever since advising Boris Johnson on his campaign for the presidency of the Oxford Union 35 years ago. Now, Luntz has undertaken a survey of this nation for the Centre for Policy Studies, focusing on language and attitudes towards political and economic issues. And he's here to discuss those findings ahead of the survey's full publication later this week. Frank Luntz, what were you actually trying to understand with this survey?
Well, in 3 words, populism, wokeism, and extremism. I've seen the damage that it's done to American politics, to the American economy, and I don't want to see that happen here in the UK. I spent 3 years at Oxford in the 1980s. I was recently a lecturer for a week at the Blavatnik Institute at Oxford, and I loved it. I really do love it here. And I appreciate the civility and the decency that people exhibit. I appreciate the respect that they have for different points of view. And it's, in essence, a warning, a wake-up call, and a roadmap for how to avoid the mess that we've got in America right now. And I say this on the 4th of July, and it really disappoints me because I still love my country. And I'm still patriotic. I still get emotional when I see the flag. But I get emotional when I see your flag as well, the Union Jack. And I want to see understanding. I want to see respect. I want to see civility across the political spectrum. So that's why I'm here, and that's the purpose of the CPS study.
Well, we were talking earlier on the programme about that issue, and we just had a by-election, I think you'll know here, where I have to say it wasn't particularly characterised by civility. But let's have a look at the whole picture. Let's start with what people think about political leaders in Britain. You asked a question about how political leaders make people feel.
And look at that. That's the number one answer. We gave them a list of 18 attributes, and disappointed came in first, ignored, irrelevant. The first 8 words, we gave them 10 negative words and 8 positive words. And the first 8 that they chose were all negative. That this is a wake-up call for the Conservatives, for Lib Dems, for Labour, for the Greens. It's a wake-up call for everyone in politics that the public isn't hearing you. That you may be speaking, you may be doing events, you may be sending them emails and texts, you may have a website. But to them, it's all noise. You need to cut through the clutter, and I'm going to give you 3 recommendations for it. Number 1 is that they want to know what you're for, not what you are against. So don't define yourself by the other party, define yourself by yours. Number 2, the highest priority right now is honesty and trust. So be candid with them. Say what you mean and mean what you say. And number 3, safety, security, strong, successful, that the number 1 focus is still the economy, but number 2, right underneath it and right behind it is crime. So give people a better quality of life and they'll give you a re-election.
That's, that's quite a big steer for us as a programme. It sounds like we'd do better in ratings if we had fewer politicians on. Bit of a problem for us. But the point you make there about division, which we discussed earlier on, in the United States, we see a lot of division on the issues of race and so on. Is that reflected here? What's the greatest divide that we're seeing in Britain today?
The number 1 divide is by wealth. It's by income inequality. We've got the same challenge in the States. Even the Conservatives who talk about economic freedom, even they prioritize rich versus poor as the number 2 behind British-born versus immigrant. But overall, the rich versus poor divide, and by the way, this is a warning for the Conservatives, that they need to understand and reflect the public's feeling that nobody succeeds if everyone doesn't succeed, that this idea of every and all is essential. Every person needs a shot at success. Every person in every community needs a shot at a ladder up, the opportunity to succeed. It's not the definition of what happens at the end that matters. They're not asking for equal outcomes, which is a labor challenge, but they are asking for equal opportunity. They're asking for a healthy economy, an open economy, and they're asking that they be respected as hardworking taxpayers.
That's interesting because, that's clear, and that's a traditional divide in this country. But we hear a lot of noise about what people these days call culture wars, the issues of race, of religion and religious fundamentalism and all of that, and this relatively new word, which other surveys recently here suggest nobody really, or most people don't really know what it means. Wokeism. What are we following America in our obsession with that, or is it something that's not going to matter to us?
I think it's going to matter deeply. It doesn't matter right now, but it's coming. There are many ways that America follows the UK. Your vote for Brexit was an indication of a hidden vote that Donald Trump took advantage of. Your vote for Margaret Thatcher back 40 years ago was the leading indicator for Ronald Reagan. And there are times when America is ahead of you, such as Bill Clinton to Tony Blair. And right now, wokeism, cancel culture, the language is mean and harsh, and the outcome will be negative. As you've got right up there, the conservatives are deeply afraid of wokeism. Labor's more afraid of racism. Even though 1/3 of your country does not know what wokeism is, it's still the number 3 concern, the number 3 ism. And here's why. They know that it's divisive. They know that it's polarizing. They know that it's not being put forward to have a better, more unified country, which is what the CPS study is all about. It's about unity. Wokeism is about division, about polarization, about punishing people for success and not respecting hard work and meritocracy. And by the way, I don't know if you've got this data, but to my surprise, people put equality over meritocracy. Now, I need to give a proviso. Inequality is unacceptable in 2021 UK and 2021 US. Inequality, a discrimination, that we expect everyone everywhere to have that opportunity. And we want that opportunity to be available to everyone based on hard work, creativity, and outcome. So I would think that we would want to cherish meritocracy, but right now, equality is a higher priority to the British population.
One of the one of the outputs of the, if you like, this concern about these issues of wokeism and so on is what's called cancel culture, i.e. people's essentially having the right to free expression deprived. What do we think about that?
We think that freedom of speech is the number one freedom. We believe that freedom of speech, freedom of expression. So nobody wants to cancel rallies. Nobody wants to limit protests. It's a very, very small percentage of the UK population, but they want to ensure that those who work hard, play by the rules, pay their taxes, that they're respected, not punished. And you'll see a big difference between conservative voters and Labour voters on this issue of cancel culture. And in fact, on every issue, we have a divide in America, personally, in the way we treat each other. That divide is not as great in the UK. However, the UK political policy divisions, priority divisions, are even wider than the US. And I will tell you from personal experience here on the 4th of July, on a day that I should be celebrating by going to fireworks and having burgers and coleslaw and just celebrating independence, it's very hard to celebrate because we are so mean and so ugly and so rotten to each other. The language that we would not accept our kids using is language that politicians use against each other every day in America. And I don't want to see that in the UK. We've been conducting focus groups with CPS.
Yeah.
And the response is people are respectful and decent and disagree with each other in a positive way. That's the kind of politics you want to practice. That's the kind of politics we should be doing in America. And I want to ensure that that kind of politics stays in the UK forever.
One shouldn't say it on Independence Day, but maybe the Brits have something to teach the Americans about being nice and civil. But by the way, one of the results which I thought was very interesting is that we don't just have a low opinion of politicians, but also to some extent of business leaders. And I think you've got a result about what we think business leaders ought to be doing.
Yes, and the one thing that's a shock to me is that climate in this country is now universal, that this is the only country where arguably more people on the right are environmentalists and are focused on issues of climate than people on the left. That's not happening anywhere else in the globe, but it is happening here. This is the one area where universally the British public says, let's be environmentally friendly, let's have a cleaner, safer, healthier globe, let's put our environmental community first. It's very impressive to see.
I thought it was really interesting that actually Conservatives appear to be marginally more concerned about business leaders doing something on climate change than Labour supporters.
Yeah, but you know where we got universal agreement? The business community should stay out of politics. They want business to focus on business, focus on employees, focus on their employees, not workers. And by the way, they're no longer businesses, they're employers, because the British public is so much more supportive of those who create jobs than they are of that company itself. And they want customers, they want to focus on employees and not on shareholders. And what's interesting is investor is so much more supported than a shareholder, because a shareholder is just about making money, and investors making a personal commitment in that business, in that employer, and in the future. So we have a whole business lexicon that'll be helpful to those involved in the British economy. And believe me, they need to use it, because right now the business community also has some credibility issues.
Frank, you need to spend more time with us. We are basically so nice and lovely and polite on this side of the water. It'd be good to see more of you.
I got to tell you, frankly, I don't want to go home. I want to stay here, but I need to leave in a few weeks. But thank you. Once again, even your interview on Sky is more civil than what we have in the US, so I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it for now. After the break, we'll be talking about what we've learned on this morning's programme with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.